All right. So to start all this off, last time we talked about how a few specific communists engaged with the civil rights movement, the early civil rights movement. The whole idea of the last class was to demonstrate that what we commonly think of as the civil rights movement from like 1955 to 1968-69 is kind of an isolated affair in that chunk of time. But as more recent studies of history demonstrate, the civil rights movement has its origins dating much farther back than that. Usually due to individuals who take it upon themselves to try and fight for specific kinds of justice. So, since this is Black History Month, I figured it would be kind of nice if everybody went around the table and quickly shared one thing that they have learned about African American history in the United States as a result of an effort to emphasize this history, which began in 1926. So the origin of Black History Month comes from 1926. So why don't we go around the room and share one thing that having this month of recognition has taught you over the years. Laura?
Well, there are a lot of histories that we just don't know about. They've been uncovered by historians, and it's just really important.
Okay, Dan?
Yeah, kind of to echo that. There's just a whole lot of history that I was not presented with in school, either elementary, high school, even college. Just completely unaddressed history, which is a shame because it's such an important part of our country's history. So.
Yeah. Jim?
Among the many hundreds of thousands of things I learned was that the first person to die for this country was a black man, Crispus Attucks.
When did you learn that?
Early on when I began to get exposed to this. And it's interesting in having discussions with people who are not knowledgeable about this. They don't want to admit it a lot of times. And they get very upset about it.
Yeah, there's kind of a lingering hangover.
Go look it up. I always tell them, go look it up. Don't believe me. And then it shocks them that they didn't. And usually what happens is if they're honest about it, they'll say, how do I find out more? And that's good, so.
It's true. Usually there's like you almost immediately know how someone's going to, or what they're thinking about a topic like this, because they're either immediately interested to learn more, or immediately quick to just build the walls and start digging the trenches.
Right.
Jim?
Martin Luther King tying together Christian principles and civil rights in stark contrast to evangelical fundamentalists.
And in stark contrast to like how the civil rights movement was depicted by reactionaries as like godless and chaotic, etc. Laura?
Hi.
Hi. Caius, I'm sorry. Laura Caius, my bad.
So, I was brought up learning more about American history than most people did because a lot of it is not taught in the schools, but I'm still learning. One thing that I've learned is that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves, only the slaves in the Confederate States.
Yeah, it didn't immediately address the border state issues. Michelle?
I have to think of my name. I don't know really what I learned early on, having come from a similar background to Kaya's, but I knew a lot. And the thing about Crispus Attucks is that it's in one of the songs, I think, by Earl Robinson.
Oh.
And that's how I learned it back when I was a young teenager. But recent history, our classes, and the webinar with Honey last Sunday just encouraged me to start pulling out some books and reading. So I'm reading his book now. And that to me is very informative, particularly about Coretta Scott King and her role, and also the developments with the labor movement and King's involvement in that. So
Well, I remember in my middle school and high school experience that what Black History Month taught me, because my school treated it as like a theme for the entire month. So whenever you were in a social studies course or a geography course or whatever, it was somehow themed around Black history. And one thing that always stuck out to me was the ways in which we remember the significance of civil rights is one thing, but there's a lot of more just colloquial daily things in our lives that we don't realize how much impact African Americans have had towards. A great example would be the film Hidden Figures. Have you ever seen that?
Yes.
About the African American mathematicians who were working for NASA. So, they taught us about that in my school, and I remember learning about it, but what always kind of like threw me off is like, you never see that in pop culture. You never see, until Hidden Figures came out, for example, you didn't see the side of NASA where the significance of African Americans was played out. We taught about it in African American History Month, or Black History Month, but outside of that context, it was almost as if they were, hidden figures. They weren't there. So African American History Month has always kind of had this mixture of both showing me what is significant about African Americans in United States history, but also demonstrating how for the rest of the year we almost pretend like it's not that significant, or it's not that important, or maybe, I don't want to put it so negatively, but it's not as endearing in quality as we emphasize it in February. That's what I learned, and it led me to think that there has to be a more inclusive story year-round, and that Black History Month can be a recognition not just of particular achievements at certain moments in time, but achievements that are lasting and are with us every single day. So today I want to focus on two events and one person, which I feel kind of does that. They highlight the significance of activity across a large, as opposed to being a specific instance. The first event was more or less a movement, and that would be the success of the unemployment councils during the 1930s. The unemployment councils were created across the nation in the start of July 1930, and their purpose was simple in theory, but their task in accomplishing it was pretty monumental overall as the nation descended into the Great Depression. The second event that I'm going to talk about is how the Communist Party defeated efforts to use race baiting as a means to dividing the workforce at the Ford Motor Company at the River Rouge plant in 1941. I have 40 listed here. It's 1941. That's just a typo. This was an important early battle that is gaining more attention by scholars as a possible early example of fighting for civil rights before 1950. So, like I said last time, Hosea Hudson's experiences and Benjamin Davis's legal battles are significant examples. The fight of the Wildcat Strike in 1941 is another example gaining more attention. Finally, I want to talk about Angela Davis and her significance to African American history and the history of feminism, because they are interrelated. It's kind of part of the whole argument that she makes. I brought two books with me today. I brought Angela Davis's Women, Class, and Race, which we'll get to at the end. But then I recently got Read Feminism, which is a great book on the role played by American communists in the 20th century feminist movement, and how they attempted to kind of, just like what the Communist Party did in 1936, to tug on the New Deal policies of the Democrats and keep them away from reactionary Republicans. This book makes the argument that communist feminists throughout the 20th century tried to tug on the second wave feminist movement in a more radical direction.
And the author is?
The author is Kate Weingart, or Weingand, sorry.
Kate Wein.
Gand, G-A-N-D at the end. The book is published in 2001, but this is the third edition of it. So, to start, I wanted to go over the unemployment councils. I talked about them a little bit before, but I want to get really specific into a couple of examples of how the unemployment councils impacted African American lives. After 1929, the CPUSA was tasked by the Communist International, also known as the Comintern or the Third Communist International, with building a domestic movement for socialism. When the Russians came to this conclusion, they were not referring to like a political campaign or a specific union. They were referring, these were all smaller parts of a larger whole in the eyes of the average communist at the time. It was understood as a dynamic of all working people. So we have to not just have unions and community organizers and then political activists. We need all of these people working in concert with one another to have a large social movement. In 1930, the typical communist activist was usually found in one of three dominant spheres of social activity. They were either advocating the political policies of the CPUSA, such as writing about it in the Daily Worker, or disseminating the Daily Worker, or writing about it in The Communist, which is a more theoretical journal. Or they were organizing radical labor unions as an alternative to the quote-unquote reformist AFL and the kind of locals that were created by the Socialist Party. Or, finally, they were organized in communities that were trying to combat racism and unemployment. And it's this last category that led to the establishment of the Unemployment Councils of the United States, or the UCUS. In major cities, such as New York and Chicago, the Unemployment Councils played a significant role impacting the lives of not just Americans, but specifically minority Americans and the unemployed. In Chicago, for example, when communists were informed that an African-American family was sitting outside their building on July 15th, 1931, as the council was having a meeting right down the street, the council immediately suspended the meeting and ordered all of its members to head to the location. From there, one by one, council organizers and members broke into the building, broke into the apartment, moved each piece of furniture from the street back into the building, and forcibly turned the water to the building back on. If you ever wonder what a communist should be doing when they see injustice like people being evicted in the midst of a mass depression, or you ever wonder what you should be doing today as a communist, ingrain this next part into your memory forever. The best communists of the Great Depression broke all forms of civic laws for the purpose of challenging the worst effects of capitalism. When they saw African American families and evicted and left outside to die, they broke city laws and state tenement laws to provide them back with a home, even if it was temporary. When the New York City Unemployment Council heard word that the city was going to divert resources from its soup kitchen in the Bronx to South Manhattan, they knew that they had to act. The change came as a result of the mayor of the city. Does anybody know the mayor of New York City in the 1930s?
Is it Fiorella?
No.
Jimmy Walker.
Jimmy Walker, that's right, yeah.
And Jimmy Walker wanted to save money by having the soup kitchens and their resources closer to the docks. The idea being we're getting them in on the ships. We don't want to pay someone to transport them 260-something blocks up into the Bronx, so we're just going to have everybody come down to South Manhattan. What's the downside of that?
Well, how are you gonna get there?
Transportation.
Yeah, if you're dependent on soup kitchens,
You
do
don't
you
have-
so easily have access to the means to go? What is it? I looked it up. 271 blocks south of the Bronx.
It's about 5 miles at least.
It's
5
huge.
to
I
5
think it's like 8.5 miles.
Probably, yeah.
It's a pretty big distance. So the decision meant that the now unemployed and homeless citizens of the Bronx would have to travel over 270 blocks to receive their food. The New York City Unemployment Council held a meeting in early September of 1931, which lasted only about 10 minutes. After the meeting was adjourned, they cleared out the space of the CPUSA storage office and 2 apartments that were above it in the South Bronx and turned it into a makeshift soup kitchen. In just one day, they managed to feed over 250 individuals. By the end of the month, they were feeding about 900 per day. Over 60% of the kitchen's staff were African American, some of the highest employment ratios in the work done by the unemployment councils, and they served a hungry population of New York City of pretty wide mixed ethnic background. Similar to what the council did in New York, the Unemployment Council of Los Angeles performed similar efforts on behalf of the Latino and African American population of Southern California. The unemployment councils as a whole were arguably the most successful community-based program that communists in the United States ever endorsed up to that point. They were not explicitly communist organizations. So like their charters did not say we follow the tenets of Marxism, Leninism, etc. They weren't trying to focus on that. They were more practical organizations focused in their community. But they were heavily staffed and funded by the local branch districts of the Communist Party. They resulted in more people fed, more people clothed, and more people with roofs over their head than any single communist policy idea internationally throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. More commonly than not, it required communists to violate the law, and in doing so also expose how certain laws reflected the same corruption inherent within capitalist exchange. So, in other words, communists did not break the law and break into buildings and put people back into their homes because they wanted to break the law. They were doing that because they wanted to demonstrate what will happen if you try to help people get a roof over their heads, help people get food, get clothing. What are the powers going to do when you try to do that? They will come and repress you. They will arrest you on charges of breaking and entering and all this other stuff. And it makes people weigh out, well, how much do I support breaking and entering if it means that people are going to die in the street? That's the message that these unemployment councils were going for. They wanted people to make these mental decisions in their head. So, the next time that you ask yourself, what should you be doing in terms of organizing? Ask yourself what you'd be doing in 1931 if the unemployment council of your city was breaking the law to get people fed, clothed, and housed. Would you help them? Would you risk going to jail over such activity? If the city attempted to shut down your local soup kitchen and your unemployment council wanted to respond, would you be willing to give up your office space or your own home to try and host a soup kitchen? Those are the kind of questions that you should ask if you're weighing out the idea of, am I being like the communists of the past? Are we upholding the virtues that this party has done successfully in the past? Those are the kind of questions that I feel should be asked. Robert Corstead, historian of the American left and a writer of a book titled Civil Rights Unionism, which is a very important book. I highly suggest everyone take a look at it. It's a pretty thick, like 800-page tome, but it nevertheless is very important in drawing in the significance of all these different organizations.
What's his name again?
Robert Corstead, spelled Korstad. And in 2011, he stated in that book, in the second edition of that book, that the unemployment councils of America did more for advancing the civil rights of minorities than any other organization between 1930 and 1934, including the NAACP. He also pointed out that they gained the most attention by civic studies majors and scholars, but most of these individuals who were studying them and writing about them either neglected or simply failed to point out that these councils were in large part responsible by the Communist Party. Still to this day, this is a story that I and some other historians feel need to be repeated and retold ad nauseum to younger generations who have an even larger disconnect from the significance of the Great Depression than my generation has. I remember growing up and being taught about the Great Depression and thinking of it as like one of the worst economic experiences our country had faced. Younger generations today don't have that much of a connection to it. They went through, even in their younger years, they experienced the recession of 2007, 2008, and to them, that is a more relatable economic experience than the Great Depression ever will be. So I think it's important to help people understand the role played by individuals during the Great Depression so that we can then see where our role is going to fit in another recession or another time of crisis. Anybody have any questions about that? That was my first event that I wanted to talk about, and then I'm going to go into the one at Ford Motor Company. Any questions?
Explain a little more about these unemployment councils. Were they community organizations that people volunteered to be on?
So in the earliest period, yes, from July to September of 1930, yes, it was pretty much all volunteer based. By 1931, especially in New York and Chicago, they were by far the biggest and most successfully organized unemployment councils, followed closely by Los Angeles, followed closely by here in Detroit. By 1931, people were being assigned to work in the unemployment councils. Usually, for example, if you signed up here to the Detroit district, the Michigan District Branch Party in 1931, and you said that you wanted to do work in education or you wanted to do work in unemployment, you would most certainly be directed to the Detroit Unemployment Council, or the DUC that I call it because it's DUC. By 1934-35, they had kind of faded in terms of how much power they could influence in the community. By that time, you now had unions who had enough finances and capacity to organize large groups together. But they still were more or less based on appointeeship by 1934-35. Does that answer your question?
Oh, go ahead.
It isn't a question. My parents didn't talk a whole lot about what they did during those years because it was the 50s and you didn't talk about it. But my dad related a story about taking a delegation to the mayor, I assume New York, and how he took his pants and his slacks and took black shoe polish to get rid of all the gray in them because that was his only pair of pants, or dress pants. But how they went and demanded some assistance for the people of the city. My mother said, my dad was a real candy, he really liked chocolate. But she commented once, yeah, well, during the Depression, you could buy a chocolate candy bar for a few cents, and that was your father's meal for the day.
For the day?
For the day. Well, they had something or other at night. I have no idea what it was. But anyhow, it sort of struck me that if that's what some of the leadership did, imagine what people who were economically affected, who weren't organized into activity, what their lives were like. And you read about people putting cardboard in their shoes or newspaper in their shoes because they had worn holes in the bottom. It was major serious. And there was no Social Security and welfare, and there was no support. So people were either on their own or organizations supported them. Anyhow.
Was it in 1931?
I have no idea what year they were, but my parents were in the States. And
Because
what
there was a
year
big,
they were in Moscow.
because there was a huge march on
Yeah.
City Hall in New York City
Yeah.
in 1931 after the death of the communist organizer Steve Kotovas.
Okay.
And William Foster led the march.
Yeah.
So yeah, it could be possible that was because they made those same demands to the mayor.
Yeah. I know that he was one of the leaders of the unemployment struggle.
Yeah,
But
and
I don't know, I never found out from him when they were where.
which particular time. And to further elaborate on your question, or my answer to your question, by the end of 1931, the unemployment councils were so tremendously successsul at gathering people's attention to
Yeah.
homelessness and evictions and people who were starving that by the end of 1931, I don't think anybody had any reservations about whether or not the unemployment councils were or were not communist. I don't think people cared at that point. Communist as a word was not a very heavily red-baited term in 1931. You could use it to call it had the same effect as calling someone a radical, but it didn't necessarily delegitimize them entirely. So if you were to go up to someone in the soup kitchen of the New York City Unemployment Council and say, this whole place is run by communists, all the people who are standing in line for the soup kitchen aren't going to just leave the line.
Right.
But is the soup any good?
Yeah.
Do you know, it must have been during that time that my parents were in New York, because it was soon before World War II that they were not in the States.
So they left in the years leading up to World War II, like during
They were
the Spanish Civil War.
reassigned.
I guess so.
We're reassigned.
Jim had.
Yeah, I had the fortune to be mentored by many of the people who were in the unemployed council. And I remember they told me about it, that some of it was spontaneous. They weren't all communists. That was a big later debate where some people had this attitude, everybody, and then I listened to some of the other people, and it wasn't true. But it doesn't matter, except that it does matter in the sense that you understand how broad the movement was.
Mhm.
And the concept was that spontaneity was that, as the idea grew, was that the Smith family down the street had their furniture put out, and within moments, people would just come out of nowhere and put their furniture back in. And the sheriff would show up, and some of our guys would show up with shotguns. You know, a lot of people don't talk about that. They would say that we're not gonna let you come in here. So it was really a very touchy situation. And some of them didn't, but some of them did. This also was the group that organized the Ford Hunger March.
Yeah, I was actually. That's the next.
I'll-
That's where we're
I
going
won't, I won't
into.
talk
Yeah.
about that then, but that was one of the things.
Yeah.
The other thing was that, well, that came also, the funeral, the mass
Mhm.
march, but that was part of
Yeah.
it. But they used to, that was the main thing. And a lot of it was centered around where I live now, which an area then was known as Black Bottom. It had nothing to do with the color of the people, by the way. It had to do with the color of the land.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand that, but it's important.
It
That's
took me
the
like 2 years to learn that. After
Yeah,
moving
right,
here.
that's,
I was
right,
like, wow,
anyway,
wow,
that
what?
was, that whole area, and there were, they used to tell me about, there were several barber shops in the area where all these guys would meet. And mainly guys, some women, but women wouldn't go into barber shops in those days. So, and they would talk, and that's where Dave Moore, whom we all knew, or most of us knew, you didn't know, but a lot of us knew him. And others would gather, and they would, and as I got involved much later in life, they still would meet, and I'd go, I was about 18 years old, and I'd sit and listen to all these people. They all have all these great ideas, and you know, I learned a lot just listening to all these outstanding people. Many of them were communists, some of them weren't, but they all had a leftward orientation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
leftward, generally, something's wrong with the system. And that was the general thing. And they were also helped to organize, you're right. One of the things they did was to organize the Trade Union League, the Trade Union Educational League, which I know we're not talking about, but that was a forerunner of the CIO. And then I was told also, maybe off the subject I don't want to get, was that once the Wagner Act passed, then workers flocked in to join the union. And for that, you'd only get a few at a time, and you know, which proves something, and that is that people are law-abiding. And in the sense that even though they would go and break into a house and put the furniture back in.
Yeah.
But once it become a federal law, and that's why the struggle is so different, and that's why it's so important for people like us to understand that we do understand. And some people on the left don't understand this. You pass a law, it becomes a federal law that you can join a union. That's important because now, my understanding was at that time, 1935, 36, whenever it was, people would pour into the union halls to sign up.
It's funny, that reminds me of the quote that Bernie Sanders said in the most recent debate, of the quote from Nelson Mandela. It's like,
Oh,
it always seems impossible until you get it done.
Yeah, right.
It's like,
right,
yeah,
right.
until you get a law passed that recognizes your action as legal, it's
Right.
going to be a huge uphill battle.
That's right.
But you also reminded me, so I looked it up recently. I mentioned it the last time I was here, but I didn't have the whole quote memorized.
Yeah.
But I can't remember if it's from, I don't think it's Lenny DeCow or if it's from someone else. But in 1937, he was asked about his involvement in the Unemployment Council of New York City.
Uh-huh.
And he said, the most employed people I've ever met during the Great Depression were the communists. They worked 10 to 12-hour days. Most of them got no pay, especially if you included all of their yakking time. He said they were in on any strike or any effort to evict someone I had ever seen. They were, if they did not start the movement itself, they were the Johnnies on the spot, who were the first ones to arrive and respond to things like they hear someone gets evicted.
Yeah.
The Detroit Unemployment Council says someone got evicted on the street. It was usually the communist of the council who would be like, well, we're getting up and we're going right now.
Yeah.
And the last part of the quote is the communists brought misery out of hiding in working class neighborhoods. It's a great quote, but you just reminded me of it.
That's
right there.
interesting. I never heard that one.
So, were you going to say something as well? No. Okay. So that's a good segue though, because we are now going to just move right into a more focused discussion on Detroit here and the battle at the River Rouge. So, as a result of the Detroit Unemployment Council, or the DUC, and its success of organizing the Ford Hunger March in 1932, communist presence throughout the city swelled tremendously during the late Third Period and the Popular Front. The Third Period is 28 to 34. Popular Front is 35 to about 38, 39, depending on who you're talking to. Some people like to cut it off at when the Soviets made their pact with the Nazis. Other people like to cut it off with the Spanish Civil War, but that's not what's important here. By 1936, the Detroit Unemployment Council was staffed nearly 90% by the Michigan District CPUSA and created a base of operations to link together numerous community and labor organizations across southeast Michigan. Some examples of what they did: they also set up routine soup kitchens, but more importantly, they would usually host barbecues and cookouts, and then they would bring the food to striking workers, either, for a great example, at the Flint sit-down strike or at a few of the strikes in Hamtramck. Due to the testimony of company spies like William Gurney, we also know that the Unemployment Council helped the CPUSA integrate shop floor organizers into various Ford plants by providing them not only meeting space, but by also hosting formal dinners and gatherings. It was during this whole time period, the mid-1930s, when the CPUSA expanded its reach across Detroit, and the Ford Security quote-unquote service department acted under the command of Henry Ford's top security advisor, Harry Bennett. Everybody knows who Harry Bennett is? Pretty ruthless guy. Bennett was described as the ringleader of a, quote, gang of thugs by labor organizers for his firing upon unarmed striking workers after Foster's speech in 1932, as well as his involvement in the public assault of the union organizer Richard Frankenstein on May 26, 1937, on the bridge that connects over to the Rouge plant, as well as his ordering of the kidnapping of UAW organizer Walter Reuther. Who here knew about that?
Kidnapping?
Right, yeah.
It wasn't a successful
Oh,
kidnapping.
right.
In this latter instance, Reuther, who had recently succeeded in organizing a strike against Federal Screw, who was a part supplier for the Ford Motor Company at the time, was threatened at gunpoint by two of Bennett's men in the evening of a bargaining settlement at his house. So they had gathered at his house to kind of celebrate a bargaining agreement. And these two men showed up, just busted into the door. One of them had a revolver, and they attempted to take him custody. They said, quote, "Okay, Red, you're coming with us." Now, what happened next is a little bit dramatic, at least in the way that it's been depicted by those who were there. But essentially, three of the organizers in the room, who were Communist Party members, one of them was a friend of Eugene Dennis. He had a revolver on him as well, and said, if you plan on taking him, you're going to have to take all of us. And a kind of weird sort of standoff occurred, and eventually they called the police, and the police showed up, and then the two men were forced to be removed from the property. Although the kidnapping was a failure, as Reuther's family and friends informed the men that they would likely never leave the apartment alive, the event struck fear across union ranks, and you can probably imagine why. It made it seem like this man, Harry Bennett, had the ability to act above the law.
Mm-hmm.
He had some kind of authority that you had to call the police in order for his authority to be checked. He could just act until someone tried to counter it. Many people began to arm themselves for fear that Bennett had the power to mark people for death. In April of 1941, holding out as the last auto manufacturer to cave to a union, Henry Ford and Bennett decided to make their move against the UAW by discharging 8 of their union organizers at the Rouge plant. And this was this was April of 1941. The response, 2 days later, by 50,000 workers at the Rouge plant was to walk out in a wildcat strike that quickly sparked national headlines. Bennett responded to the event by setting up machine gun nests to attempt to prevent strikers from barricading the plant that were at the northern side of. See, this is why I wish Steve was here, because Steve, like, geographically knows the Rouge plant.
Oh, yeah.
On the northeast side of the plant is where they, like, bring people in today to do, like, the tours. But where and that's where some of the workers were barricading at the time. But where the majority of people were barricading was at that time, the main entrance that was on the southwest side of the plant that connected to where the foundry was.
Right.
And then you'd have to walk past the foundry to get into the main plant itself. Bennett's next solution was to try and promote interracial violence among the workers, so as a means to preventing the UAW from gaining any traction. This was best recorded in a book called Strike Breaking and Intimidation, a history book by Stephen Norwood, where he explains that interracial violence among white and black workers at Ford was a genuinely real threat that had been an issue since 1934. Since African American employees tended to look favorably upon Henry Ford's philanthropy in the black community, as well as the company's providing of some of the best opportunities for non-white workers in the country. So, does anybody know, like, what do I mean by why would African Americans like Henry Ford in the 1930s?
He would hire them, and he paid them the same as white workers.
So he paid them higher than you could get elsewhere, and he also paid them at a fair standard. However, there were contingencies that were required with it. But the philanthropy aspect in the community is another one. Ford spent a lot of money building up the area around Dearborn. He built a lot of schools, he built a lot of parks, and I think that the African American community, they were very, they liked that integration. Why? Because either they or their parents had moved to Michigan within the previous decade. And where did they predominantly come from? The Black Belt.
But where did they move to? Not Dearborn.
No, but they were attracted because of the differences from what Ford was doing in Dearborn and then hiring people versus what they were experiencing back in the South, which is the industry owners and the sharecroppers. They had no interest at all in supporting a community of African Americans. They just wanted it as a pool of workers. Not willing to pay you the same wages at all in comparison to white workers. So the $5 a day is probably the most famous example of attracting workers from around the country to come and work at Ford. Something that is usually left out when people talk about the $5 a day in labor history classes, it was not applied equally across the board to white and black workers. If you were a African American seeking the $5 a day, you had to attend 6 months of courses on etiquette. You had to attend a Sunday school, and your children had to attend the Sunday school, and you had to do, I can't remember the specifics of it, but you had to do some kind of like community volunteer work in Dearborn. After doing these 3 things for 6 months straight, then you could be given $5 a day. So
Well, the other thing was that Ford had a lot of influence in the west side of Detroit, where a lot of black Americans live. That's why at that time there were more Ford workers in that part of the city than the other parts, because of the location of the plant. They used to ride the streetcar on Verner, I can't remember the name of it now, and they would ride to, and then they would take buses and streetcars from that area. But he invested a lot of money and time, and he also had a lot of ministers, black American ministers, in his pocket.
yeah, that's another great point, is that there were a lot of church ministers in the black community who were supportive of Henry Ford.
Well, he would go and, here some family comes here from Alabama, where a large percentage of black Americans came from in Detroit to Alabama, from Alabama. and they would have nothing. And this man would offer them a job at $3 a day. That's more than they were getting down here.
Mhm.
And, you know, and then all kind of other opportunities of that sort. That's why he was so popular. And there
Exactly.
was a big battle ideologically over that. But
So you can see how then this is a difficult situation for
Right.
people who are trying to organize this lot of workers
Right.
when they're all in one plant. It's probably a difficult situation for those who are not trying to organize it, but for those who are trying to choose should they be part of the union or not. Specifically, if you're a white worker or an African American. This aspect, this is an aspect that many white working class Americans had difficulty grasping at the time. They could not understand why African Americans did not see the supposed obviousness of Ford's capitalistic ways in the way that they understood it, in the way that they felt the need to strike in Flint against GM, in the way that they felt the need to do a wildcat strike in 41. For the white workers, this was a predominantly labor-based issue. It was understood that by striking, you could pose a challenge and then get collective bargaining agreements. They didn't understand why African Americans didn't always see eye to eye on that issue, usually because they didn't think or dig deep enough to understand that there were reasons why these African Americans had moved to Michigan, and it was not to come here and start a strike. So that's an important thing to remember. To the African Americans moving north from the South, Henry Ford's employment program was unsurpassed for minorities in other parts of the country. African Americans were typically willing to go through all of the requirements, including the 6 months courses on etiquette, Sunday school, and then working for the company for 6 months with no issues whatsoever, as well as attending company-hosted events. They were willing to do these requirements because of how serious their plight was where they came from. To them, it was all an upgrade. I don't think it was in any way like a burden, whereas a lot of white Detroiters saw this as, in order to earn $5 a day, I got to go send my kids to this school and take etiquette classes, and I can't have any issues with the company for 6 months. Well, there goes my effort at working in the union. I can't be in the union for 6 months if I want to do that. So
And did they go to a specific Sunday school?
I don't remember. I'm pretty sure it was handpicked by the Ford Motor Company which one they'd be going to, but I don't know if it was like built by the Ford Motor Company or not. I highly doubt it was, but I'm not 100% sure. But overall, because of this, there was always friction between white and black workers in the community of Detroit over supporting union efforts. On the one hand, you had a situation where African Americans could genuinely benefit from organizations like the UAW and the Detroit Unemployment Council. On the other hand, many of these African American families were simply grateful for the opportunities that they had, regardless of how limited this opportunity may be for white workers. Bennett, so to go back to our story here, Bennett knew all this. Bennett was very much aware of these divisionary tendencies. And he capitalized on it by issuing propaganda in the form of leaflets throughout the Rouge plant that stated the UAW, quote, wanted nothing to do with the African American community, and its unions are dominated by nefarious Jews. Once again, proving that by linking anti-Semitism with fears of racial violence, you could form a core association with radicalism and keep people away from it. Unfortunately, at first, this tactic did work, and for the first 2 days of the strike, the African American workers of the Rouge plant refused to participate in the Wildcat. They stayed inside the plant. They were paid $1 a day, but they didn't really get anything done. There weren't enough people in the plant to be making cars, but they did not want to defy Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company, so they stayed in the plant for the first 2 days. In one instance, in which some of the white workers who were striking outside kind of were inappropriately making, racial slurs and attacks at the workers who were still inside the plant, resulted in a few of the African American workers coming out of the plant. A small scuffle broke out and there was a fight, and police had to show up and kind of break up the event. All of this played right into what Harry Bennett wanted. He wanted this division to occur so he could say, look, I told you, these communists don't care anything about African American rights. They don't want to help you out. All they want is support for themselves. So the CPUSA and the Detroit Unemployment Council responded by withdrawing most of their activists from the strike. They gave out a very specific order in mid-April. Pull out. Just get out of the whole scene. And they did this for two reasons. At least this is how I see it. My two reasons. First, it was a logical choice to avoid any further attempts to advance rhetorics of red baiting. So by removing the activists, you're removing the ability of Harry Bennett to say communists are behind this strike. Second, those that were pulled from strike activities were not just like told you can't be an activist anymore. They were instead redirected to go into the communities throughout Wayne County and inform African Americans that Bennett was trying to keep them divided. They teamed up with non-communist organizers from the UAW, the NAACP, and most importantly, they convinced a lot of those church ministers in the black community that what Harry Bennett and the Ford Motor Company was doing was manipulative, coercive, and deceitful. After 3 more days from that, it seemed as if the tactic had worked because the African-American employees at the Rouge Foundry walked out and joined the strike, effectively killing Bennett's plan. After 10 full days of the Wildcat strike going on, Henry Ford buckled. There are some theories that suggest that his wife, is her name Clara? Is that what her name was? There's some stories which suggest that Clara had a little bit of a coercive role in convincing him to accept the strike. But it effectively resulted in the first contract signed at the Rouge plant, fully bringing in the Ford Motor Company into the auto union movement.
What year was that?
This is 1941. This is all in April of 1941. Yeah, it was one of the shortest strikes. And it's also in 1941, so consider what's going on. Like, the government is also pressuring companies to avoid stagnant strikes and to find ways to concede with striking workers because war is right around the corner.
Right, and what year did we join a war? Wasn't that 41 as well?
December. I mean, we didn't anticipate the attack on Pearl Harbor, but I'm pretty confident that the War Department was ready to go to war in Europe. I mean, we were already sending them supplies and sending them Liberty ships and sending them ammunition. So any attempt to limit strikes and to mitigate the quarrels of workers was seen as a positive in the eyes of the federal government by 1941.
When did Reverend Hill and Paul Robeson become involved? Was it during that strike?
Yes, that's when
Yeah.
I was gonna mention that the NAACP went out there and tried to broadcast into the plant. And that was not successful. This was what I was told. I'm going by, secondhand. But when they called Paul Robeson out there, and he sang into the plant, that was very successful.
Yeah, that was on day 8, I believe. And it was
Yeah.
kind of near the tail
Well,
end of
it's
the strike.
important also to remember, one of the things that I learned, you asked what I learned about Black American history. When I was in the military, met a lot of Black American workers who were soldiers. And their 2 heroes were Paul Robeson and Du Bois. And that really struck me. It never occurred to them that these 2 guys were supposed to be communists, leftists. That was because they had spoken out on the issue of rights and equality. So, but that's interesting. But what my understanding, I was told, is that Robeson came out there and was very successful in helping to bring them out. The other thing was, as you pointed out, and this was also told me by the old timers, that if we had not been successful in organizing, we might not have had a union at Ford, because World War II took place.
Mhm.
The union signed no strike agreement. Would we have been able to do that in 1946 after World War II? I don't know. That momentum might not have been there, and it might have been many years later that they might have had. Who knows? So it was a lot involved there.
It's a little bit of a side discussion, but I do think it's an important question, because you say, like, we might not have had the union if the war had started sooner or something like that because of these no strike pledges. There were a few communists at the time in some of the more radical sects across the country who argued that you shouldn't sign the no strike
That's
pledge,
right.
that if anything, World War II is the most ideal time to strike, because you will
Yeah.
bring the whole system to its knees
Yeah,
by
I told that,
by doing it. And the party did not endorse that. The party sided with what the workers sided with.
yeah. Right.
And that's an important principle. And especially when we talk about Black History Month, there's a line in the Communist Manifesto where it says, communists do not make policies or advocate positions that are contrary to what the workers want. Now, I feel like you can, it's not even amending it, you're just kind of rephrasing it to also say African Americans. You know, if the significance of African American workers is something that we want to acknowledge as important in our struggle, then just like the statement says you don't make a policy that sides against workers, you don't make a policy that sides against what the majority of African Americans want. If they don't want to go for national self-determination and they don't want their own separate country, then you listen to James Ford when he says, this is a great idea, but I can guarantee you African Americans don't want this. They want to be part of the Republic. We should listen to that. We should not try to argue in theory, like, you know, well, in the high abstract version of communism, it should be this way. Well, let's ask them first, and then we'll move forward.
That's
All right. Which
I think Robeson's role, though, had to do with reassuring African American workers, but also my understanding of the situation was that he also sang in other languages to help
Yes.
solidify the
That's right.
foreign-born workers
I forgot.
who were numerous at Ford.
That's right, I forgot.
Polish and Ukrainian
And Italian.
and Italian.
I've always wondered that, like, so in the 30s and 40s, were the language divisions as culturally defined as they seem in the history books? Like when you go to Hamtramck, were people speaking Polish?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Totally.
Well into the 60s.
Black people living in
Absolutely.
Hamtramck were
Speak
speaking
Polish.
Polish.
Really?
Yes. My mom
That's
had
true.
a friend who.
That's
Really?
true,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
Huh? And were
Yes.
like in like a German neighborhood, people would be speaking
Yes.
fluent German.
Yeah,
Yes,
Huh?
Until they dispersed into the suburbs and lost that.
yeah.
Huh?
but in parts of Detroit, it was, I mean, you'd find it in the restaurants, you'd find signs written in other languages and,
Hungarian,
yeah, Hungarian, right.
Ukrainian.
The reason why I ask is not to again be a little bit more distracting from our discussion here, but in my book I'm talking about how the language federations played a
Yes,
role
absolutely.
in splitting the Socialist Party, and I feel that the narrative focuses so much, especially Theodore Draper. It's like, well, this is how you know it's Russian dominated. It was a Russian and a Hungarian language faction that were trying to take over the Socialist Party, but I think it's missing the complexity of it. As you guys are pointing out, at that time, there were entire divisions of the city where you were
That's right.
speaking. So a language federation doesn't make sense to people like us today. Today, we try to be inclusive and we want
know.
Right.
to understand and be on a common ground. But back then, people had reason to stick
Yeah.
into a federation that represented your ethnicity and your language.
Right.
And I don't think you can overlook that for the purpose of saying, well, it was the Russians.
But that's how people got loans to get a house. That was the banking institution, that was the credit union development. But there are three
That's
of
true.
us here who all had relationships with the language federations. The dance troupe,
Right.
Ukrainian
Right,
dance
I remember that. Yeah.
troupe that Laura and my kids were in.
Yeah.
And the Jewish group that
Mhm.
Kaya and I sang in the chorus.
Uh-huh.
And
And they
when
had
I-
it also the Yiddish cultural group, it's called Yiddish Culture Farband or something.
yeah. And when I first got married, they held the wedding party for us. I mean, it was, and I wasn't particularly part of it. Well, I sang in the chorus, but because of my parents, they had the relationship. But up until the 60s, 70s, how late did the dance troupe
We
go?
were until the late
80s?
70s, early
Yeah,
80s.
Early
yeah.
80s.
And we were funded by the Detroit Workingmen's Co-op, which is mostly Russian and
Russian.
Ukrainian.
Now,
Yeah.
were these organizations, from your experience, were they predominantly ethnically bound, or was it more geographically? As in,
No.
because you said that there were African Americans living in Hamtramck who would speak Polish.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So would there be African Americans in that who would speak Hungarian? No?
no.
No,
Never
okay,
heard
so there
that,
was
no.
still some
Yeah.
little bit
Yeah,
of
right,
barriers
it's just
between.
for some reason Hamtramck.
If you went to their fundraisers, they spoke their native language.
Yes, we sat through many a dull speech in Ukrainian for 1 hour.
Oh, that must have been fun.
Or Russian, whatever, I was listening, yeah.
That must have
We're
been
getting
fun.
off
And that's where the International Workers Order got involved.
That's right.
The
The IWO?
I was told that, you know, you have one worker on the line, Ukrainian, Polish, Black American, Italian American, and so forth, and so they couldn't communicate. So the IWO was an insurance operation that was all left oriented and organized, and they would use that to not only to have insurance but also to educate the workers about this brother. I forgot about that Robeson is saying in all those other languages.
That
I was told that.
That's what I was told.
Yeah.
Do you know how many languages he sang in?
Oh, he's
A lot.
a lot.
He was brilliant.
He sang in.
But like at the
China.
strike,
Oh,
he sang
at
in
the
different.
strike.
I don't
Yes,
know.
at the strike, the story goes that he sang in several other languages. My guess would be he sang in Russian.
Yeah,
That would be predominant.
probably Italian. There were a lot of
And
Italian American
maybe-
workers
And
out
maybe
there.
Italian.
A lot of Italian American workers. out
But he could, I mean, he could sing in
there.
8 or 10
Who
So
was
languages.
Reverend Hill that you referred to?
Reverend Hill was the minister of Hartford Avenue Baptist Church. And he ran for city council along with Novak, didn't he?
Stanley Novak.
With
right.
Stanley
Oh.
Novak.
Right.
Polish,
Yeah. Both left wingers.
left wingers. Well, Stanley was a member of the party.
He was, yeah.
Because I chided him for sitting.
But he didn't run as a
paper.
he didn't run as a communist though.
He didn't run as a
No.
He ran as
communist.
a
No.
as a progressive.
He
Right.
published a Polish paper.
Yeah. Right.
Los Ludovic.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
was it?
Right.
It comes back. It comes
Anyway,
back.
yeah.
All right, so let's move on to the last bit I want to talk about today. And I saved the best for last, and I also saved the most philosophical for last. So I want to talk about Angela Davis and intersectionality, much more so than we mentioned in our previous class.
Oh, and what was the name of her book that you were talking about?
Women, Class, and Race. I have it right here.
It's become practically a
Women, Race, and
textbook.
Class.
I assigned this in my
Yeah.
U.S. history course. I usually assign 2 books for my students to read, one by Abby Hoffman and then this. This is to, when we talk about the second wave feminist movement, to understand how second wave feminism did not just stop at, fixing the uniforms of Pan Am. That it went beyond that to challenge patriarchal and racial norms in society. So, today I want to talk about the significance of Davis's understandings on racial theory, slavery, and the legacy of racism in the United States. In this monumental work, which was published in 1981, Women, Class, and Race, Davis argued that under the standard definition of slavery, which depicted all black people as chattel, quote, women no less than men were viewed as profitable labor units and thus were commodities within slavery similar to the commodity of wage labor under capitalism. This focus on the genderless component of slave labor is directly contrasted against wage labor, where gender is both a defining quality of not only the type of work expected from you, but also mediates the rate of pay by a standard deviation between men and women. What is the standard deviation these days? It's like for every dollar a man makes, it's like what, 71 cents?
Yeah.
75.
75
That's right.
cents. So, yeah, so
I was gonna say it's going up.
Yeah.
under wage labor, gender directly impacts your value as a worker. Under slavery, Davis points out, not so easily. Under slavery, you are a profitable labor unit that is genderless unless your gender can be summoned for value and use. In other words, whereas under slavery, men and women both work and toil to produce the same commodities, under capitalism, men and women work through socially defined roles. This can be understood as a reference to the overt nature of slavery as a political system that legally binds an individual to compelled labor, in contrast to the political system of capitalism, which only legally binds an individual to property. It does not bind them to compelled work. You are required to pay rent, you are required to buy food, and in order to do those things, you must work. But the immediacy of it is not compelling you to work. Davis's work essentially pointed out that slavery commodifies the slave into what Marx called fixed capital, a fixed and a prepaid asset or an operating expense, as opposed to the variable capital of paid wage labor. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Mhm.
So, additionally, Davis uses Marx's labor theory of value, which asserts that all value in society is the product of human labor power, to express the fact that slaves, much like wage laborers, have values that are socially imposed and defined solely by their maximization of profit. The primary difference then between free workers and slaves is that slaves are calculated into the formula as a fixed value, while a wage labor is calculated as a variable value based on the demand of the labor. This use of Marx's labor theory of value ultimately adds to our collective understanding of racial injustice because it directly asserts the intersectionality of class, gender, and race as opposed to merely argue it as a possibility, like other scholars had done up to that point in the early 1980s. To understand how this labor theory of value relates to racial theory, Davis first framed racial constructs under the context of exchange and motive, much like what Marx does with the commodity in Das Kapital. If we see socially defined racial constructs as the product of a society whose development and its history depends on slavery, racism is an effort, whether conscious or not, to valorize particular human beings in very abstract ways. Their input into the economy, their social standing, their significance into the society, either over or under that of a socially defined norm, which is, what's the socially defined norm?
White male.
The white Christian male.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Marxist scholar John Somerville, who I used when we were talking about, he was the one who said, like, think of this as a piece of paper, and that the paper transforms over time. John Somerville argued that the traditional historically materialist conception of value rests on the fact that, quote, man cannot live, or at any rate does not live, without expressing and applying value judgments in their daily routines. In many cases, these value judgments are not conscious efforts on behalf of us. We are not sitting there going like, to me, that's worth this. To me, that's worth that. We're not doing that in our head. Rather, these values are socially imposed. They are learned values that reflect less of an objective understanding of value and instead are built on very conditioned variables. Over the course of thousands of years, human civilization erected entire legal and cultural norms based upon these socially defined standards of right and wrong, both consciously and unconsciously, as it developed through periods of peace, conflict, and war. Above all, these standards have shifted over time, just as society has shifted, to reinforce the nature of these value judgments as merely just part of society, that they're very normal, that these are normalized ways to think about value in society. Rather than, Davis does not accept this. I mean, she's aware that this is how societies function. She's aware that this is what people are doing in their daily routines, but she does, rather than accept values as subjective interpretations of some real absolute truth, Davis instead, quote, takes in the fact that people are social creatures who live in and through a network of relationships with other human beings. This network includes people with shared interests and values, such as people who attend the same church, as well as with people who exist among others that share very little interest and values, such as the dynamic between employers and employees in a factory, or slaves and their slave owners. In all of those contexts, there is a shared relationship experience that has an immediate effect on how individuals see value in society. Under this context of value, moral and legal codes are, quote, and this is me quoting Davis, an attempt to select and define those actions and forms of behavior that are good, and those that are evil, those that are allowable, and those that are not allowable or tolerable. This extends to efforts to legalize and reinforce systems of oppression, such as slavery, where peoples defined by their ethnicity and forms of behavior are subjected to socially defined allowance of human ownership. So what I'm referring to there, how many have heard of the, it was brought up in numerous movies, the totally whacked theory that African Americans deserved to be in slavery because they were racially inferior.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm talking about here. It's by defining racial inferiority through ethnicity and behavior, you are subjectively trying to give logic to human ownership.
And even Lincoln believed that.
I'm sure a lot of people at that time believed it. It is from precisely this juncture in theory that Davis built her understanding of the social relationships that are both shared and unshared between slave families and free families during the first wave feminist movement and the intersectionality of gender, class, and race. To understand slavery, Davis says, one must understand how slaves uniquely represent both a commodity and a class in a manner different from wage labor. They exist as a direct and legally exploited labor-producing class that must be reproduced on a daily basis. In other words, in capitalism, workers are input units for the means of production. In slavery, the slaves are the means to the means of production. Get what I mean? Unlike outside systems of slavery, the reproduction of human life under slavery exists as a commodity with a fixed value. It is the reproduction of their daily lives. Whereas the free worker is compelled to work by circumstance of needing money to pay for their own means of reproduction, the slave is compelled to work by physical force, and their subsistence is important insofar as much as it allows the compelling force to continue. In other words, the only reason why the slave owner feeds the slaves is so that he can continue to compel them to work. If he had a means of feeding the slaves that did not actually involve feeding them, he would take that path. If he did not have to sustain them, he wouldn't do it. As such, the reproduction of human life within the context of slavery mimics that of the maintenance of fixed capital in a factory as opposed to the variable capital of wage labor. Minimal care for labor unions at their maximum output is not only preferred, they are socially reinforced and institutionalized. Also, unlike wage labor, the transparency of class oppression under slavery was overt, since, quote, anything produced over and above the cost of producing the slave and maintaining him or her was taken by the slave owner as surplus product. Everything that was produced by the slaves was taken as surplus product. Thus, slavery is not hiding its oppression in any way. It's overtly ripping the values away from one person's hands and putting them into someone else, and using legal, socially defined codes to justify it.
How does sharecropping fit in there? Because it's a variety of that.
Yeah, and that comes after, so there's actually a great, I can't remember which history book it was that I was doing, but it was a U.S. history book that was talking about Reconstruction. And it was talking about the breakdown of a slave plantation and how it results in sharecroppers. So if you look at a map of a slave plantation, usually there's the slave house, the slave owner's house, very large centralized building in the middle of the plantation. The farms are around it, and sparsed out in the farms are the slave quarters. Usually like 6 to 8 buildings in each little quarter, depending on how big the slave plantation was. Well, when Reconstruction occurred and slavery is uprooted, the federal government goes in and kind of breaks up the properties and sections them off into little tiny districts and forces the plantation owner to sell the slave quarters to the newly freed slaves. And since obviously they don't have the money to buy this sort of stuff, what do you think then results? It's a kind of 19th century version of feudalism in which the slaves have to accept a debt in order to live on the land that they've already been living on and work the land that they now own through a debt, and then pay off the plantation owner.
Yes.
And that is how it builds the sharecroppers in general. It's a very, I remember the first time I read that, it was how sad it was. Just like hearing, it's like you think of feudalism as like ending in the the 14th or the 15th century, and then you read that and you're like, that is literally what they were doing in Europe in the 12th century. So to reiterate, the quote, transparency of class oppression is important to remember here. Slavery does not hide its oppressive qualities, whereas capitalism does. In the context of the United States, this meant that by 1886, the vast majority of white laborers did not see the oppressive nature of capitalism when it was contrasted with slavery, while the vast majority of African Americans emerging out of slavery could easily see the replication of systems of oppression. In other words, Davis argues newly freed slaves had a more acute understanding of capitalist oppression than white workers did in 1886 when the Haymarket Affair happened. And that is a very important fact about African American history that everyone needs to understand if you want to then further understand why divisions in the working class were so hard to overcome by the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So Davis's earth-shattering conclusion was how the reproduction of the means of production required much more attention by the owners of production in slavery than it did under wage labor, particularly with regard to ethnicity, sexuality, and gender. In traditional studies on slavery and production, the socioeconomic position of class formed the basis of slaves' understanding of power, since both men and women, as I said before, were viewed as profitable labor units. So to them, the oppression was direct from the slave master to the slave. In her analysis of rape and sexuality under capitalism, however, Davis suggests that the entire production system of slavery, quote, relied as much on routine sexual abuse as it relied on the whip and the lash. As profitable labor units, slave exploitation, unlike that of free labor, could be enforced through sexual exploitation when it served the interests of the slave owner. And I actually even think here maybe in the context of when Davis was writing, it was true, but I think that a lot of people in the Me Too movement today would argue, well, maybe we could extend what Davis says to capitalism as well, and that sexual coercion has a role in capitalist societies as well. But nevertheless, I don't want to argue against Davis here. I just want to point out that we could think about this in a more, and I'm quite certain Davis would completely agree with that statement anyway. So, furthermore, Davis distinguished between more common and ubiquitous, quote, sexual urges and, quote, institutionalized rape that was endemic of the experiences of slave women in the 18th and 19th centuries. Socioeconomic class, defined by Marxists as one selling of your labor power to provide to someone else, played the most central role in this setting because, quote, the economic domination that was the most gruesome hallmark of slavery permitted a, quote, license to rape. Institutionalized sexual oppression within slavery, therefore, was another means of control and another means of dividing up your workplace. What's the most effective way to divide up a workplace that cannot already be divided by its race, its ethnicity, its belief system? When you're dealing with slaves in the United States in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, how are you going to divide up that workplace when they're already kind of, for the most part, culturally uniform? You do it by the only real division that exists, which is sex. Quote, when it was profitable to exploit female slaves as if they were men, they were regarded in effect as genderless. But when they could be exploited, punished, and repressed in ways only suitable for women, they were locked into their exclusively female roles. So what does that mean? Davis has a lot of examples that I don't immediately bring up here, but for example, she says, if you were a slave owner and you really wanted to drive a wedge into the homes of your slaves and really exert your power, you would go right up and rape a female in front of her boyfriend or husband or whomever, her family. And that immediately shows the power line. And it kind of, it informs everyone else who either witnesses it or hears about it, that the power line is real and the power line can be enforced through these means. In effect, Davis identified how under certain material conditions, a slave's value could take on more acute and gender-specific roles within the same overarching system that tried to depict them as genderless. In the book Red Feminism, Kate Weingard argued that women, class, and race expanded upon the arguments that communists had been making for decades about the differences between white and black female oppression in the United States. Scholar Kimberly Crenshaw is credited with coining the term intersectionality, but Davis is more appropriately getting attention these days for being the first to really draw attention to the ideas behind that word and what that word actually refers to. Weingard argues that this lack of recognition in our society stems from two sources. First, that there's a general tendency among feminists in the first and second wave groups to disassociate themselves from radicals. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about first wave feminism. Who is it that the suffragists were trying to distance themselves from?
Socialists.
Not the socialists, pre-socialists.
Pre-social.
The
These
anti-slavery.
abolitionists, yeah.
The abolitionists.
Oh, yes, that's right, yes.
Yeah, they
You're
tried
right.
to maintain distance
That's
from
right.
abolitionists because they saw it as, we don't want to be associated with this kind of radicalism.
That's right. Yeah.
In the second wave feminist movement, this meant avoiding associations with the Communist Party and radicals such as Robin Morgan. Does anybody know or remember Robin Morgan? She wrote a manifesto called the, quote, Bitch Manifesto in 1967, which called for female supremacy. So people tried to avoid those sorts of radicals because they felt this is going to detract from our effort to gain more rights for women.
Where was
Robin Morgan?
Morgan from? L.A.
I actually don't know. I don't know
And
where
when did
she's
she
from.
write this?
67 was when it came out.
Never heard of it.
No,
Wasn't on our radar.
not yet.
Well, for kind of the reason that I'm suggesting here is that the mainstream second wave feminist movement would actively work to suppress you from hearing that stuff in the same way that the suffragist movement would not invite abolitionists to their meeting because they don't want their members hearing about that.
But
They
some
want.
of the suffragists were allied with abolitionists.
That's not what I'm saying. Of course, a lot of these people were on board with the program. I'm saying publicly, when
Yeah.
they hold their
Oh, yeah.
meetings,
Right.
they don't want to be associated with it because that will break the movement.
When you see the pictures, they're all white women.
Oh yeah,
When
it's
you
the
see
Seneca Falls
photos,
conventions and everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this second cause, the one where people are trying to avoid associations with radicals, was a hangover that many on the left still deal with today. The rampant sexism and male chauvinism of the old left. Despite all of its great qualities, the old left, including the Communist Party, is guilty of a great many acts of injustice laid against women, particularly African American women and other minority women. Emma Teniuka, for example, who organized the entire community of San Antonio in 1938, pointed out that her marriage to a white Texas CPUSA leader was muted by the leftist press, such as the Daily Worker, and eventually both she and her husband were shunned out of the party by 1942. Dorothy Ray Healy, a Jewish American communist from Los Angeles, noted in her autobiography that sexual favors for male organizers and activists was a routine and expected duty of female activists in the 1930s, particularly the younger women in the YCL. Even going back to the era of abolitionism, Frederick Douglass noted the excessive elements of sexism rampant in the abolitionist movement and how it hurt, not helped, the overall cause for the emancipation of black people. All of this led Davis to elaborate on the cultural differences between black people and whites in the United States, particularly regarding supposed myths about black men. The most prototypical myth that was perpetuated by the 1950s was the idea that black families are inherently matriarchal and that African American men lacked the ability to lead a patriarchal home. This is usually referenced in the language of, quote, this is me using Davis's language, the idea that African American men rampage around society while African American women are the real heads of the home. Davis said that regardless of behavioral norms, because she basically states in a lot of cases this is true, African American men don't end up owning the home first. It ends up being the African American woman who owns the home first. And more often than not, African American women remain in one home, whereas African American men have a tendency to move around from home to home. Davis says that regardless of the behavioral norms, there is a historical explanation for this that if you do not acknowledge, you are essentially perpetuating racial tropes. She says, in slave homes, there was a family dynamic fundamentally different than outside in the wage labor families. Home labor was inherently valued more in a slave family than it was outside. And here's what she meant. If you were a slave living on a plantation, your understanding of value is paperless and moneyless. So you're not paid any money. All the food that you are living on is provided to you at a bare subsistence level. So if you want to have a better meal on a daily routine, what do you have to do?
Yeah, raise your own food.
You have to start making your own food. You have to, and more importantly, you have to do that on the small amount of time that you actually have for yourself while you're not working in the field or working in the house. Now, what do you think the effect that has on how those individuals perceive the value of the food that they make? Do they value the food more or less than the average person?
If you grow it yourself, I think
Yeah.
More.
Yeah. So they understood value in a more immediate way than the wage laborer does, who goes to the store and is alienated from the production system and buys it off of a shelf and brings it home. The slave had to make the food extra if they wanted to have a higher quality amount of food. Same thing, labor in the home, such as maintaining the slave quarters. Slave master doesn't care how you keep your slave quarter. As long as it's healthy enough so that it reproduces your daily life, that's all that he cares about. But if you want it to be nice, you want it to be clean, to be dusted, to have the cooking area suitable for cooking good meals, you had to do all that work for yourself. So the home labor was also more immediately understood in value than it is outside of capitalism. Because in capitalism, are you paid for cleaning up your home?
I wish.
No, you can pay people to clean up your home. Maybe they understand the value of how much work it takes to clean your home. But if you're cleaning your home yourself, that is what Marxists call unrealized value. We don't have a form of realizing that value except to cherish it personally. Well, slaves not only cherished it personally, but also it created a value that they then carried on into subsequent generations. So, in other words, if we think about how certain scholars of racial theory talk about the way that African American families are matriarchal, Davis suggests that unless you understand the ways in which black women inherently value home labor different than non-African American or white families, you will never understand this the reason why more African American women tend to have a say in the household than in the typical white Christian nuclear family. And that to impose the idea of a patriarchal norm or to suggest that African American men are in some way doing something wrong because they are not the patriarchs of the family and the household, Davis says you fundamentally do not understand African American history.
That's true.
Does that also kind of tie in, or does she tie it into the fact that, you know, obviously the very high rates of incarceration of black men throughout U.S. history since slavery end? Does she think that have any kind
Oh
of
yeah,
influence
it's
to it?
all part of the
They're
discussion.
not there.
Right. I mean, it's hard to be a patriarch of a family if, you know, you're put in prison so that they can then make you work as prison labor.
It's all part of the
Just
discussion. In
continue
fact, that's a
slavery.
great point. In the same chapter, she points out how, you know, usually when one of the reasons why African American men, especially young men, are targeted is because they are targeted as being deviations from the norm. So if they are not pursuing a path that will lead them to be patriarchs of their home, they're seen as criminals. They're seen as whatever you're doing, it's going to lead to criminal behavior. And Davis is in many ways suggesting that targeting effort is done because of the fact that they don't understand African American history and the way African Americans value social labor differently than white Americans.
Okay. So it's kind of probably backwards of the way most people would think of it. You know, that the difference in the view of labor at home changes the dynamic, which then helps contribute to the incarceration,
Mhm.
and then kind of creates a feedback loop rather than the incarceration itself leading to the more matriarchal family unit.
Yeah, and it goes into where's the I have to just look for it, the chapter title. There's a chapter called the Yeah, Rape, Racism, and the Myth of the Black Rapist. In which she talks about, so the black rapist, this idea of like African American men like running around the country rampaging and like raping white women and like causing problems. So like when they point to people like Emmett Till or they point to the Scottsboro Boys, she says that myth, that perpetuation of a myth, results from this misunderstanding of value and socially understood values. I think, where is it? Oh, the myth of the black rapist of the white woman is the twin of the myth of the bad black woman, both designed to apologize for and facilitate the continued exploitation of black men and women. Black women perceived this connection very clearly and were very early on in the forefight against the fight of lynching. So, you know, Davis is saying African American women, because of their understanding of the social value of work in the home and of labor in general, they were, before black men, the first to realize the immediate oppression facing black people as a whole and black women acutely. The case of Joan Little, tried during the summer of 1975, illustrated this point. Brought to trial on murder charges, the young black woman was accused of killing a white guard in a North Carolina jail where she was the only woman inmate. When Joan Little took the stand, she told how the guard had raped her in her cell and how she had killed him in self-defense with an ice pick that he had used to threaten her. Throughout the country, her cause was passionately supported by individuals and organizations of the black community and within the young women's social movement, and her acquittal was hailed as an important victory made possible by this mass campaign. In the immediate aftermath of her acquittal, Miss Little issued several moving appeals on behalf of the black man named Delbert Tibbs, who awaited execution in Florida because he had falsely been convicted of raping a white woman. So, in general there...
I remember that.
Oh, you remember that?
Yeah.
Do you remember the first instance as well in North Carolina? When she killed the guard
Yeah.
with the ice pick?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I remember that.
What'd you think about it?
At the time?
She certainly was justified. Yeah.
Do you know that in hindsight or at the time? Like, I guess what I'm
No, at
asking
the
is
time.
unpack how the culture disseminated that story.
No, at the time, there was also a case in Michigan, in Upper Michigan, of a woman burning the house down with her husband in the bed because he'd been torturing her, raping her, for a long time. I can tell you who the lawyer was.
Wow. I think the point that Davis is really going for is this idea that we over-exaggerate the significance of a particular act because of who it's involving racially
Well, that's right.
and sexually. Especially when we apply this, a woman acting onto a man, under the context of a black woman stabbing a white security officer in the jail, is immediately assumed to be, she's the problem, like she's the chaotic element in that scenario. And vice versa, you flip it around, an African American man and a white woman occurs, it's immediately reversed. The white woman is now the innocent victim,
Right.
and the black man is the perpetuator of the problem. He's the chaotic element. So Davis is saying this tie right there is what must be understood for all future generations to go forward with understanding capitalist oppression, especially with regard to race and gender, is that, you know, under certain contexts, the immediacy of guilt is placed upon someone because of their ethnicity and because of their socially defined role in society. So that's is what I think is most important to get out of this book here. There's a lot of things to get out of this book. I'm not trying to say this is the only thesis of her work here. And in her other book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, she elaborates a little bit more on how the point of this is just intersectionality in general.
What does intersectionality mean?
So it refers to the ways in which societal oppression can be weaved between race, class, and gender.
Okay.
So in traditional Marxism, we think of societal oppression as an umbrella that is rooted in a class division.
Right.
And even historically, if we go back into all of human history, the origin of human civilization is based on a division of labor. At some point, someone decided, you go dig those trenches and make a trough. You go start planting seeds and build agriculture. You go out and hunt. It required a division of labor,
Right.
which then results in civilization. So classical Marxism places class on a pedestal. Davis isn't necessarily saying that that's wrong, but she's saying that to not understand the ways in which gender and race impact divisions of class
Right.
is to miss the point
I
entirely.
see, okay, that makes sense, of course.
I think that's a great example, though, that black on white
Yeah,
and white killing the black. I think that could be developed as to how to explain it in a kernel, because people, I think, I'm different than, my reaction is different than maybe mainstream of who I would find guilty,
well, I actually find when I assign this to students, I'm very proud that the vast majority of my students come out
They
of
get
reading
it,
this
huh?
book understanding that particular point.
Well, that's
Maybe they
good.
don't understand her point about why class is still an important dividing
Yeah.
factor in society, and maybe they don't agree with her emphasis that the solution to this is mass, movements and stuff like that. But they nevertheless can read an example like that and immediately understand. I do see how it's not even the legal structure we're talking about anymore. We're talking about just social norms and customs can
That's
have
good
this
to know.
immediacy of an effect of blame. Yeah.
I see, the reason for that is because we grew up at a different time.
That's right.
There's a whole generation of people like this,
Low banner.
and this young man and you, who have a whole different, don't know anything about all this stuff that happened before. Because I get into conversations, and they, I can't explain to them how a whole generation of white American youth, up until recently, were taught that the war between the states, not the Civil War, was caused by the fact that the federal government wanted to interfere with our right to determine what our state was going to do. And slavery had nothing to do with that.
The lost cause narrative.
I mean, slavery had nothing to do with this whole thing
It's
that
not how it
happened.
was taught.
Yeah.
And this was taught to a whole generation of people. When I went
Yeah.
south in the military, I ran into this all the time. And I began to realize, and then I was told recently by my daughter-in-law, that's what she learned in school. So now you have a whole generation of young people, probably in the South too, I don't know, who never experienced any of this stuff. Well, what are you talking about? Jim Crow, segregation, I go to school with black American kids, white American kids, Chinese American kids, and so forth. We go to work, we live in the same neighborhoods, and so sometimes maybe we don't, and stuff like that. A good example of that is where I live, and that is it's a 99% black American co-op. In recent years, we've had a number of white American young people like yourself come and try to buy into the co-op. And the reason is because they're not even thinking about all this stuff. That's what the difference is. They don't see all that old. So therefore, your students are in that generation, and they would say, yeah, I could see that. They don't look at it the old timers, unfortunately, look at it a little differently, and generally as a generation.
Yeah, and especially, we're talking about a book that came out in 1981. So when what you're referring to there is the lost cause narrative, which was a dominant narrative in U.S. history up until like 1994 or 5.
Yeah.
And I think that, I can't even, if I had a penny for every time I've heard someone say like, I don't know what they're teaching in, the schools these days. Like when I was a kid, they used to teach us that the Civil War was about federal rights and states' rights, and like, I don't
States'
know
rights
why
for
they're
what?
I don't know why they're changing the narrative, etc.
That's
It's
right.
like, so yeah, they're hesitant to accept these new interpretations of
Right.
history, but you are right, it is changing. Why do you guys think that narrative is changing? Like, when I ask that question, I don't mean like in a very abstract way. Like, do you think that people, specifically younger generations, are just becoming more palatable to these notions of interpreting the past differently? Or do you think that certain events, such as the civil rights movement, the women's movement, even kind of the collapse of the USSR and the kind of thawing of tense ideas and tense hostile feelings about communism, do you think all of this kind of coalesced together to create a new atmosphere for ideas? Like, what do you guys think?
Well, and a lot of the people I know that are my age and younger, I think even though materially there's still some big differences, among men and women and people of color and white people, at least socially we're supposed to assume that there's equality. So if you grow up, assuming there's equality, it's a lot easier to notice class distinctions because they're not being obfuscated by things like gender and race. So I think it's a big part of why the younger generations are so much more open to ideas of socialism, because they can see the inequality, but it's not just hidden behind, it's because, black people don't work as hard, or, obviously a lot of that still exists, unfortunately, but I think it's a lot less prevalent, which makes it a lot easier for them to recognize class issues.
I think people are more integrated in their housing and in their work than they were back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And their experience is different. But I think the women's movement plays a big part. I think of Harvey, what's his name? Weinstein. And the horror that I think many, many women have over him and his behavior, and how predominant it has been in Hollywood, but in other situations, in anything where the male is the responsible, is the head of what McDonald's, the harassment that goes on there of women. And I think that people are much more attuned to that. I think that they understand that and are repelled by it. So their reaction to something like Angela Davis's premises, I think, is more open.
I think that's a fabulous example. The Harvey Weinstein one's a great example because it, along with numerous other ones, if you look at, you can see that we've made progress in terms of talking more about this and being more open to understanding these kinds of oppression. But that example also shows us how much further we have to go, because what is it? There's only like 4 women who actually testified in the court, but there's a list of 40 women who supposedly made allegations, but they just refused to testify. So there's only a few that are willing to go so far as to actually press legal action. The vast majority aren't speaking up about it. So that should signal to you, well, how many other people aren't speaking up about it? How many other instances are going on?
Imagine your reaction, all of us, your reaction to having a job interview in the hotel room of the person who's going to hire you.
Oh.
Yeah, right.
Ooh, that's
You
just
must,
creepy.
Oh, was that? Was that Weinstein?
Yeah, and it's
I didn't know
common.
that. Yeah.
It's common practice.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes.
Unbelievable.
Well,
It's common practice in the Hollywood,
Oh, in the Hollywood
in
gang,
in the scene. I'll bet it's common practice other places too. But I can see a woman going, "You want me to do what? Where? I'll meet you at McDonald's. I'll meet you at Starbucks."
And then you wouldn't get the job.
Right.
Well,
It's like that right there is once again
That's a problem.
drawing the line of
It is.
oppression.